Hi guys, nice to see you all.
Hello.
Thank you very much to everybody for joining again. I know we've got a couple of faces who've been on a few times. So I'm not going to talk for long, just going to hand over to Jock. He'll do an introduction and then get cracking with managing product managers. Over to you, Jock.
Okay, hello everyone. So I was going to say, before I kind of jump into the introductions and the slides, obviously this is a round table, and if you have any questions, don't be shy about putting them into the chat. We'll pick up with them. We're going to have three kind of separate roundtable discussions on three topics related to managing product managers. So feel free, if any questions kind of come up as you're coming along, then just pop them in the chat. We'll pick them up as we go along in each of the discussion breaks. Perfect. All right, so first things first, let me get my screen shared and then we can get going. Thank you very much for coming along today. I appreciate some of you are here in the UK, some are over in the US. It's very nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming. Why am I here and why am I talking to you about managing product managers? So I'm the founder of a company called Product People Limited. So I've been working with lots of different companies on a freelance basis for about 8 years now. I tend to work with teams to coach them, to train them up, but I also work as a hands-on head of product or product manager as needed. And so because of that, I've had a chance to work with lots of different organizations, including some quite large ones. So a few years ago, I was the head of product for UK government, which was at GDS, at Government Digital Service. And that meant really looking after the entire product community. So there was about maybe 40, 50 product people within just that particular office at GDS itself. But I reckon I was finding about 200, 300 product people from all of the different departments across government and getting them to all kind of start working more as a community, which is going to be one of the things I'll have a chance to talk about a bit later. But I've also been head of product for the Ministry of Justice, and generally speaking, whenever I work with one of the startups or other companies that I tend to go into, I'm going in as their interim head of product to help them get started, build their team, and build their product management. So I've managed lots of teams in relatively quick succession over the last 8 years. So hopefully that qualifies me to share a bit of what I've learned from that, some of the things that work and don't work. And yeah, that will hopefully give us a bit more insight into the kind of things that hopefully will make more sense and maybe some tips that will apply to you in your organizations. If you're interested, I've also written a book. It's The Practitioner's Guide to Product Management, and it's available generally. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the actual topics. So the first thing I think I want us to take away as product leaders is this message. We actually can do better than we're doing at the moment. And the reason for that is there was a survey done quite recently. It was a product management trends and benchmarks report from this year. It was organized by the Product Management Festival. And it surveyed 2,000 product managers across 30 countries of all different seniorities. So everything from chief product officer down to the most junior product managers. And they asked, amongst other things, a couple of questions that were quite pertinent. So the first one was, what do product managers think their manager can do to lead them better? And as you can see, there's things like provide me with growth opportunities at the top of that list, improve the way they give feedback, provide me more training opportunities. So there's clearly some issues that are coming up quite a lot across the product managers surveyed. The next finding was, why do product managers leave their jobs? So where product managers have actually left the job, this was the main reason they gave for doing so. And again, we're seeing no opportunities to grow coming up as the main ones. Poor management performance. In other words, their manager is not treating them as well as they would have liked. Bad team culture being another one. So clearly there's some issues here, and there's some things that we can do as product leaders to improve things. So as a result, what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 roundtables. The first one is going to be a recap for some people, but maybe if some people are less familiar with the role, we're going to just spend a little bit of time thinking about the actual role of product manager and really get under the skin of that. We're going to think about creating growth opportunities, so really answering that main point that came out in both what people are asking from their managers and also the reasons why they were leaving when they did. And then the last one we're going to look at is setting your team up for success. So these are things that you can do to actively change your culture, change your environment, and really create a high-performing team. So hopefully that's all good with you people. Let's start off with the first one. So understanding the role better. So as product leaders, we can become better managers by understanding the role and the motivations of a product manager better than we do at the moment. Now, obviously, some of us here on the call are themselves, head of product, have come up as product managers and sort of made their way up to leadership positions themselves. So clearly you will have a pretty good idea of what it means to be a product manager. But not every person who's put in charge of product people necessarily comes from a product management background. So it's quite a good idea to just recap or refresh our memories on what's important to our teams. So some of you should know this chap. He's a guy called Martin Ericsson. Amongst working for 20 years in various companies, having founded startups and so on and so forth, he's also the co-founder of Mind the Product, which is one of the largest product management conferences in the world. So he defines product management in terms of this Venn diagram you see there. So he says, I've always defined product management as the intersection between business, technology, and user experience. And the product manager is sitting there at that intersection. The second thing about product managers to think about is that they're focusing on outcomes, human outcomes. In other words, helping people to solve a problem or achieve a goal much more than they are about delivering things. So people often say, somewhat confusingly, that product management is 80% people and only 20% product, because actually the main focus of product managers is working with people, either on their team, their users, their customers, the stakeholders, their managers, other people in the organization. So product management is actually a very people-oriented role. And so when we're seeing what motivates them and we're seeing what they're focused on, they're really focused on outcomes. And this kind of illustrates the difference. Instead of asking people to build a thing, namely build a fuel gauge measuring in litres, a very specific thing, you might see this in a requirement if that's kind of the way you do things. What we're actually trying to do is to solve the problem of drivers running out of fuel. This particular example is dear to my heart because I used to have a motorbike that would periodically run out of fuel in the middle of the road, and then a little yellow light would come on just afterwards to tell me I'd run out of fuel. So for me, solving the problem of making sure drivers don't run out of fuel is quite important. But that's actually what I'm trying to achieve. I didn't need necessarily a particularly whizzy fuel gauge. I just needed to know before I ran out of fuel and got stranded that was going to happen. So really the message here is product managers are focusing on what people are trying to achieve, the human outcomes, rather than building features or releases, which is the output. The next area that kind of motivates a product manager is kind of their internal motivation and definition of success. So this is very much about putting the needs of users first. So users being the people actually using the product in real life. And business needs come second. It's not to say that business needs are disregarded, but it's to say that in the general weighting, user needs have a higher priority over business needs. Because fundamentally, you can only make a product successful if it solves a problem for users or allows them to achieve a goal. But if you do those things and you're able to get a product that does those things out into the market, then what you should see are all the other things that the business needs, namely revenue, profit, market share. However, if you only focus on revenue, or if you only get product managers to focus on revenue and market share first and not on user needs, then mediocre products will always result. So a product manager is really there to guide a team who are going to be delivering that product from a position of uncertainty and risk to a position of knowledge and understanding. And the way they do this is through a process of continuous learning. Now, when we're talking about uncertainty and risk, what we're really saying is there's stuff we don't know. There's a lot of uncertainties. Even in projects where there's things that are relatively well understood in terms of the components we're putting together, the particular combination of things we're putting together may pose challenges. The particular needs of that user segment we're targeting might be quite interesting and challenging. So there's always a degree of uncertainty, particularly in software development, but generally in any technology sphere. And so as a result, we're always continually trying to break down this uncertainty and risk into smaller, easier questions to answer. And doing this as rapidly and frequently as possible. And we do this through a process of experimentation with the team to figure out what works, what doesn't work. Now, quite often people try and ship a product too early along this curve, where actually they've had to make some guesses because they haven't actually had the chance to figure out the answer to those questions. And that's where you start to get problems with achieving product market fit, a product that, doesn't matter how much we push it in terms of advertising or promotion, just doesn't connect with our users. And that's probably because we haven't really understood the problem or the needs well enough yet. So you might think, okay, that's fine, but, who actually does this in real life? Well, you know what? Here's an organization you might not expect. This is HMRC, so the Revenue and Customs, HM Revenue and Customs, so one of the large government departments in the UK. And what they have on the wall to keep track of their user, how often they've interacted with their users, is this very simple chart. What they've got is the number of participants on the left that they've tested the product with. And these are going to be iterations of the product, not necessarily the finished thing. There are going to be a number of days since the last time they ran a usability test, which is just one of the user research options they've got available to them. And here's the critical one. 95% of a team observed a user session in the last 6 weeks. So what we're saying is that everyone on the delivery team, the developers, the designers, the user researchers, the content people, the product manager, the project manager, the scrum master, whoever, all of the people on that team go out and participate in user research together. And that way the whole team gains a shared understanding of the user needs rather than the product manager being the proxy or the gatekeeper to the users and feeding back to the team what the users are saying. So it's really, really important to see how this process of continual learning applies not just to the product manager, but actually to the whole team's ethos. So a product manager is a generalist working with a team of specialists. They've got a little bit of a foot in each area, like we saw at the beginning with the Venn diagram, a little bit of user experience and customer facing stuff, a little bit of business, a little bit of technology. But what they're not is a replacement for absent specialists. So the people on their delivery team. So a product manager, just because they're able to do wireframes doesn't make them a user interface designer. They're a generalist. Being able to do a usability test doesn't make a product manager a user researcher. Being able to write code doesn't make you a software engineer. However, what an understanding of those different areas at a general level allows them to do is to have sensible conversations with each of those specialists to understand what is the best way to solve the problem for the users, but also to make sure the whole team is understanding and moving in the same direction towards the same product vision. Okay. So that's a quick recap of what the role of the product manager is. Let's start off with our first round table. So in this one, what I'd like us to discuss is what you find challenging about managing product managers. What are the main areas of difficulty you find when managing product managers?
I think one of the things that can be difficult is when you have a larger team, right? And they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and trying to create an effective process of interfacing with the other organizations and members that they're supposed to work with, and creating a baseline that is effective for that diverse team. That can be a very challenging aspect.
Absolutely. Do you find that the product team is working in a different way to the rest of the organization?
Not so much than the rest of the organization, but may work in slightly different ways from one another, right? So trying to create a standardization, if you will, in being able to how the product team as an organization works with the rest of the organizations when they're all working a little bit differently. That creates a difficulty with cohesion.
What's the driver for that cohesion? Why is the cohesion important in the first place to your organization?
Repeatable process, right? We want to be able to, in the overall software development lifecycle process, we want it to be repeatable. We want it to be capable of creating the same types of outputs time and time again. And so it's helpful to allow different people with different skill sets and capabilities to level up in areas that they're deficient in, so you can create that repeatable process.
Okay, so just as a way of giving another kind of perspective or an example of this. So I mentioned I was the head of product at the Ministry of Justice, and when I was there, I had 12 separate product teams working on different services, public services related to the Ministry of Justice. So things like, making a court booking or paying court fees or doing this, that, the other. So lots of different teams solving, various different problems across lots of areas. And what we had was no specific mandate for consistency. So in other words, or rather what I'd say is we had this kind of idea of consistency, but not uniformity. So in other words, people were all still trying to do the same things. And yes, they were using broadly the same practices, but they also recognized the fact that different teams solving different problems needed to work in a different way sometimes. So even just to take a very simple example, the difference between Scrum and Kanban. Scrum is great when things are a bit more certain and you need kind of a frequency of learning of maybe every sprint, which could be, 1 or 2 weeks or maybe longer. And so it's only at the end of each sprint you get a chance to do the retrospective, to do the review of what you achieved and figure out what changes you're going to make for the next sprint. So you've got a kind of a learning and feedback frequency of maybe 1 to 2 weeks. With Kanban, the frequency is the time it takes to get from one side of the board to the other, which could be within hours. And so in situations where you've got greater uncertainty about the problem, you might want to have a feedback loop that is much shorter to deal with that additional uncertainty. And so in those situations, using Kanban over Scrum made more sense. And so that's partly the reason why whenever we're talking about Scrum Masters, we actually say delivery managers, because they weren't necessarily always doing Scrum. But what it also meant is that we had 12 teams that were actually doing quite a mixture of different things, even down to using different tools for tracking how they were going along. Because actually we weren't so bothered about the way in which they achieved things, as long as they're kind of adopting some basic agile principles and, continuous learning and user needs and that kind of thing. But it was only the end result, the outcome we're bothered about, which is, did we actually solve the problem for the people? So in those situations, whilst I fully see the rationale and the benefits of consistency of process, actually sometimes it's quite good to have variation in process, particularly if your teams are solving quite different problems. Obviously not applicable to everyone, not possible for everyone, but just as a counter example, it's kind of useful to see that can be done.
That's a really good point. Finding that a good balance between pure strict process and flexibility is where teams become most effective in creating really great output.
Absolutely. And one of the weird things was just is because the teams are working together and sort of stealing best practices from each other, what would happen is it'd actually gravitate towards a consistent process, because everyone would see each other going, oh, that's a really useful way of doing that. That's much easier than the way we're doing it. We'll copy it. And so what happened was, over time, you actually got consistency and indeed a degree of uniformity, just because everyone was gravitating towards the best way of working. Do you see what I mean? So interesting. You end up with a desired result of that kind of similar process across all the teams without really having to try and enforce it.
Yeah, brilliant.
Any other challenges that people have around managing product managers you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've got one. From my perspective, I'm working on teams on probably a smaller scale than what you've described. And it's the challenge of keeping people engaged and their personal development and progression, because logically to them, the next step up is my job, which I'm more than happy for them to kind of step into my shoes and then I can kind of develop as well. But it's kind of when it's a role that's pretty consistent and kind of that is the role, and the kind of development opportunities aren't quite so obvious. It's how to keep them kind of engaged and motivated about just managing the product, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So what I'll do is actually, we're going to deal with that in the next sort of main topic just coming up. So I'll park that just for a second because we're going to actually be talking about it in much more detail momentarily. Does anyone else have any other questions or should we move on?
No? Okay, right. Let me
I don't know if you're going to highlight it in the next section, but to Jamie's point there, I just as anecdotally, I always encourage people to find growth where growth is available, whether it's within the company that I'm at now, if it's replacing me, or if it's finding opportunity elsewhere. I'm always open about and always ready to make references for people that want to find growth opportunity elsewhere, because that's what we should mostly be about, is about growth of the people that we work with, as opposed to trying to pigeonhole everyone to staying here. As much as we want great people at our company, we shouldn't inhibit personal growth of those individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that. I just feel like sometimes I'm a kind of a nursery for other product teams.
Yeah, it does feel that way sometimes. Okay, so let me reshare my screen and we'll move on to the next bit.
Perfect. Right, so how do we create those opportunities for people to grow? So just to recap what we saw at the beginning, when people were saying they left the job, the main reason they said was because there were no opportunities for them to grow within the organization. And, that's a particular problem, particularly if we spent, as we were just talking about a moment ago, a lot of time and effort training up people and bringing them into the role of product management to begin with. And what else do product managers want from us as their managers? Well, again, lots of people want growth opportunities, and lots of them want the opportunity to do some training as well. So everyone is clearly interested in moving themselves up. You generally tend to not to get complacent product managers. Kind of inherent in the characteristics of the role is kind of a fairly self-starting mindset. So what can we do to help them with that? I want to share with you the typical kind of career path that I see in organizations. Now, clearly, it's difficult to implement a career path when you're a relatively small organization and there's just simply not enough people within your organization to have multiple levels to work through. But we'll show this as kind of an example, and maybe this will help us give us something to talk about in a moment. What I'd like to kind of start off with is, you can see the axes on the chart at the moment. What you should be able to see is left to right. Left is more product focused, right is more people focused. But as we know, product managers should be a blend of both. And then top to bottom is kind of the seniority or the level of experience. And you'll see there's this kind of dotted line, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then what we do is, as we go up the path, we maybe start off managing a single or a simple product. And then all the way up to the top, we've got very complex, more products, or indeed all of the portfolio. So let's add in some of the people. Now, the first role is kind of the anomaly, because the associate product manager is the entry-level role. So it's almost getting your foot in the door. And it's trying to overcome this problem that many people have with product management, which is you can't really do a university degree now. And I appreciate there are now courses you can do and so on. But even things like MBAs and that kind of thing don't really give you the hands-on experience you need to be a product manager in real life. So associate product manager is a role that typically I have used to bring people into the profession, but to hold their hand a bit. So they're buddied up with a product manager who's actually responsible for the product. They maybe over time gain some responsibility for maybe aspects of the product or particular features, but really their job here is to learn how to do the role through doing. With somebody there who's more experienced and can guide them along the way. And this was particularly useful in the civil service in the UK government, because product management was a completely new discipline to them when we started bringing it in. And as a result, we had this problem of lots of bright graduates, but no way within the civil service to actually train people up and bring them in. So when we created the academy, we were training up people to become associate product managers so they could learn on the job and then become product managers, where they now have responsibility for their own product. And to begin with, it's relatively simple, straightforward, maybe a single product. That'll be plenty for them to be getting to grips with. As you can see, they're beginning to be more people focused. So we're already shifting a little bit. And in some cases, these product managers, despite being relatively junior, still have a responsibility to buddy up maybe with associate product managers. Then next level up, a senior product manager, beginning to be more people focused again, maybe responsible for either more complex or more sensitive, politically or otherwise, products, or maybe a couple of range of products within a small portfolio. Then when we get to kind of VP or lead product manager, this is kind of like almost like a group area. So one particular business line, this person might have responsibility for that, but also they have a much greater responsibility to look after the product managers and the associate product managers beneath them. Okay, so very much in the middle between being product focused and on the strategy side, but also people focused in terms of the needs of their team. Now here's where we get an interesting split, because essentially you can go in a couple of different directions at this point. You can either continue down the individual contributor line, so in other words, becoming better at product management hands-on, or you can go in a direction of being more of a people leader. So if you wanted to kind of stay as a VP or a lead product manager and essentially just deal with more and more complex products, that could be a growth pattern for that particular individual. Head of product community is effectively putting the hands-on product management to one side and actively thinking about managing the team of product people as almost like a product in itself and serving the needs of that community. And of course you have the chief product officer at the very top, so board level, responsible for the overall strategy across the entire portfolio of all of the products in all different business lines, and marrying up not just the respective strategies with the corporate strategy, but also ensuring that the right people are in the right teams on the right products. So really what we can see here is that there is a career path for people to deal with more complex things or greater numbers of things as they go up the career ladder. But also there's very different options along becoming more specialist or becoming more people focused, or maybe even going on to a board level appointment. So product people at all levels can learn from each other if you provide them the time and opportunity to do so. So in other words, what we're doing is we're going to find opportunities for growth through peer-based learning. So in other words, we're going to exploit the network effect of having lots of product managers all in the same discipline. And so this acts like a professional support network, but also it's a good way of sharing expertise and sharing tips on how to tackle particular problems. And if you're in a kind of organization where there's maybe only a couple of product people, then, that's not to worry, because you can either join or start a local area meetup for product people, or you could even start one up yourself, or sponsor an existing one, and then encourage the people in your team to participate. The importance and the benefits of allowing this kind of community to get moving and to participate in it is just, you can't underestimate it. It's one of the most important ways for product managers to feel better about what they do for a living, become better at it, and ultimately to share best practice and learn best practice from their peers. And so Mind the Product is one of the largest organizations that kind of builds together a community of practice. The photo here is from the London conference, and there's about 1,500 products people of varying different levels in that audience just there. So being part of a community and being able to just simply say, I'm finding this really difficult. How do you do this in your organization? Or how do you do this? And how do you solve this? Really, really valuable. To couple this up with coaching and mentoring is also really important. So this is more one-to-one based stuff, typically with a senior product person. And it's non-directive. So it's less about kind of telling them what to do. It's more about saying, what are the challenges you're having and how can I support you and help you to solve them or get around them. And sometimes it's prompting them to try a few different things, but often the answer is within the individual to their own problem. They just need someone to bounce the ideas off. And so having someone in their organization to do that is fantastic. But if you don't have a senior product person who really understands the role, who themselves has been a product manager in the past, then maybe you can look to external coaches to come in with that experience so that they have someone they can relate to. Quite a lot of the coaching I do remotely is with individuals who are literally the only product manager in an organization and don't really have a line manager who understands their role. And as a result, what we tend to do is I kind of become a surrogate kind of manager for them by providing that one-to-one coaching. But really the purpose of coaching is to identify opportunities for growth and to support the individual to achieve them. One of the things I like using when I'm doing coaching is I get the individual to do a skills self-assessment. So this is something that I put together originally for my team in government. But essentially it's a survey where we put together ourselves as a team what we believed to be the most important skills and characteristics of a good product manager. And then we went away and scored ourselves honestly on those traits. So what we've got here is actually an anonymous example. There was no lady called Petra, the product manager in my team. But to give an example of the kind of things we could see, we can see that compared to the grey area, which is the average for the whole team, Petra feels that she is not so great at the business case side of things, the product vision side of things. So maybe these would be areas that I'd work on with her in one-to-one coaching sessions. But as you can see down the bottom left, she's particularly good at metrics. Maybe that's her background in data science. So this would be an opportunity to share her expertise with the rest of the team. So what I typically do is, prompt her to do a show and tell on that particular topic to really kind of help spread that experience and knowledge around the rest of the team. So this is something that I do. Actually, if you look on my website, and it's imanageproducts.com, I've actually got this available under Creative Commons. So you can grab the survey, you can grab kind of the way of doing it. It's very simple to put together yourself, and you can happily run this with your own team if you want to. And also, the last couple of things is just remember to actually allocate time, budget, permission for training. I know I've worked in organizations, as well as being in my own company. And I get the fact that when, costs are cut, the first thing that always goes is the training budget. If there's anything you can do to kind of ring fence that, but also remember that there's a lot more cheaper online options available these days. So there really isn't any excuse for kind of just not having that budget available for people in your team to learn more about a specific skill in product management, or even just refresh their ideas on what product management means to them. And the last piece is, again, depending on how your organization works, opportunities for product managers to gain experience of other disciplines through shadowing and maybe secondments, or maybe even learning from another product manager through shadowing and secondments, either again in your own organization or somewhere else. So think about all these different options for providing opportunities for growth within your organization. So let's do our second round table. The second question I'm going to put to you is, how can we support, what can we do to support growth for our product managers?
So one of the things that we have implemented is, it's actually company-wide, is a stipend for professional development, right? So the company is bought into the concept of professional development for the company or for the employees. And so it's an open stipend. All you have to do is submit what it is that you want to get development on, learning courses, certifications, etc. You submit that to your management, and then you get the approval. As long as it's within your wheelhouse or adjacent to your wheelhouse, if you will, it'll get approved. But it is an annual stipend that every employee gets every year, and it's really useful for someone that wants to attend, product certification courses, or wants to, get an online learning course, or wants to, buy a library of design trap books or something of that nature.
So one thing I always got my teams to do when they'd been on some training course or some certification or anything else is they had to basically present back what they learned after each thing. So first of all, that kind of puts a bit of pressure on them to make sure that they actually pay attention and not coast it. But also, again, it's getting the benefit of what they've learned and what they took away from that, and sharing that with the rest of the team. So, I didn't do it in a particularly kind of, pressured way. But it was just a way of, encouraging people to really think about what they took away from that course. And to be honest, quite often people, when they're choosing the things, would be so enthused about it when they got off, they go, "Oh, I've got to tell you about this anyway." So you almost couldn't stop them talking about it. But yeah, just adding that extra little thing to kind of encourage that sharing. The other thing I'd also do is I'd do a report on who hasn't spent their stipend for training. And just again in the sort of one-to-ones, go, look, come on, you're missing out here. You're losing out on an opportunity to gain experience and knowledge. Use it. What else do other people have on the call that they've used to help growth or promote growth for their product managers?
So we kind of, I've only just recently stepped into the role of learning development lead. I've gone from UX consultant to, front-end developer to UX consultant to learning development lead. And I think one of the things we're pushing for at the moment is we've got a progression framework, which I'm working on. So it gives you clear steps for progression. But one of the kind of issues I'm having with that really is because we're client facing, to get people to so the training budget is I guess it works in a slightly different way in that if people aren't working on client projects, then they're not actively kind of earning money, essentially, for you as a company. Now we're addressing this by having more of our own products as we go on and working more on that. So we've got a bit of leeway, but I guess it's kind of making it apparent to everybody how important it is to for them to kind of take up the, so it's like, yeah, I know you understand that if you're working for a client-facing project, then you're directly earning us money, essentially, but your training is just as important.
Absolutely.
It's kind of trying to find that balance and how to, I don't get that in the heads, I suppose, that, you this is budget here for you, take it. So
absolutely.
One of the analogies is with certain professions like lawyers or accountants, then they have a requirement as part of their practicing certificate to do continual professional development, and they've got a certain number of hours of CPD that they're obliged to get in every so often. So on the one hand, you don't necessarily want to enforce it, but if people are struggling to find a balance between client and fee earning work versus learning, then there are lots of examples from, very fee earning based professions like lawyers, where they have to allocate that time. So they have to split their time between fee earning and professional development just to be able to keep practicing as a lawyer. So, that's potentially one thing that, you could steal an example from to kind of help find that balance within the organization.
Thanks. Yeah, I said that. Cheers.
One of the things we've got, I introduced a skills matrix similar to what you've just kind of posted there, which we've had probably about 18 months or so. And the idea is, me as a manager, I don't mentor in every area because even as a manager, I don't know every area. It's impossible. So we've got that, and we look at the strengths, and we've also got this Gallup Strength Finder, which we use when we introduce people into the business. So we see where their core strengths are. Sometimes some people are visionaries, some people are thinkers, some people are analytical. And so the aim initially was to bring up the baseline level of all the product managers across the board, so that at minimum they're average, at least average or okay in every area. What I have been noticing though, and it's something I'm not sure how to correct, is we have got particular strengths in every team member. They all come from different backgrounds. And what I feel is happening at the moment is because we're trying to get a baseline level, some of their key strengths, i.e. people management, their analytical thinking, that I think we're not using them as much. So it's trying to get that balance between making sure they use what they can bring without stifling it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, as I said earlier, the role of product manager is quite a weird one because actually, regardless of what background you happen to come from, whether it's technical or marketing or sales or development or user research or user experience design, although you kind of have that skill set, you don't often get to use it in anger, because actually it's not your job anymore to do that. And in fact, one of the challenges I've always had with particularly people starting out in product management is getting them out of their comfort zone and stopping them trying to revert back to whatever it was they were doing before. So in some ways, if they're not using a particular skill set as much as they could be, that may not necessarily be problematic. The question almost I would be asking is, do they feel that they have the right skills for the problem they're currently trying to solve with their team? So in other words, whatever product we're creating, whatever problem we're trying to solve for that particular market segment, do we have the right skills within our team, and ignoring kind of job titles and so on. I kind of, just because your job title isn't something doesn't mean you don't have that skill, but collectively within the delivery team, do we have the skill sets we need to reasonably solve that problem? And it's perfectly reasonable to require different skill sets to drop in and out of that team as they go along. But I think that's the more pertinent question, which is, do they feel equipped either in themselves or with their team to understand the problem, create a product that solves it, and actively get it out to market?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Jamie, I'm waving to the side of the screen because that's where you're on mine. Who knows where you are on the screen? But you were saying earlier in the previous segment that they had some questions around growth. Do you still have any questions that haven't been answered by what we've talked about so far?
Not really, no. We've sort of taken that same approach, that we try and look for opportunities where they are, even if it's kind of learning about different parts of the business, or even transitioning into other roles and things like that, and just finding opportunities where they exist. It's just a regular challenge that we have in kind of different elements depending on the person. It's always something we're having to kind of be mindful of. But yeah, I guess we've kind of taken very much that same approach. It's just unfortunate that it's caused a bit of churn in some cases for our team, but all in a positive way. I mean, everyone that's gone on to do really good things, so it's good from my perspective in that sense. Not so much for recruitment.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, is there any scope, as it were, to increase, if not the seniority in terms of either number of products managed or people managed? Is there more scope to increase the complexity and give greater responsibility to product managers moving up the career path?
I think for the ones that are more established, I think that's naturally what's tending to happen. Yeah, they're kind of much more involved in the more complex decisions or the more strategic decisions, get closer to things from a technical perspective, or they're kind of aligned with the teams that are doing the naturally more complex work and that kind of thing. So yeah, that sort of naturally happens with the sort of more established team members. It's the ones that are kind of in this sort of transition stage of kind of being very ambitious and not quite ready and all that kind of thing. But
yep.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I've certainly I think it's possibly one of the other people on the call today who said that they encourage people to take the opportunities, even if those opportunities aren't necessarily in your organization. And I would second that. I appreciate it's a bit of a pain when, as I said, you've got to now suddenly fill what was a very good, experienced person's shoes. But at the same time, you're getting the opportunity to potentially bring in someone who's going to be as good, if not better, and give them an opportunity to similarly grow as an individual. I've had situations where somebody who has gone off from my team elsewhere has come back again much later in a much more senior position and really helped us out. And quite often I've replaced myself in jobs with the people that I'd previously hired and had gone on to other things. So, but then again, that's kind of my way of working, which is generally to get in and out of somewhere as quickly as possible. But so
what I have found is that because we've got quite a well-established team and an established process for developing people like that, we tend to get people gravitate towards us from other parts of the business. So we're not looking outside the company. We've got people that have already got the domain knowledge, but then they can come in and they can learn product management.
Well, that's great.
So, and we struggle a little with our location in terms of we're in an area where we're kind of competing with Manchester, which is quite a difficult place to compete with. So in terms
a bit of a tech hub, yeah.
Recruitment talent. So that kind of process of bringing people on internally has worked quite well for us.
Great. And there's also so much advantage in kind of, if you can spread a bit of product management knowledge and experience kind of across other areas of the company, that's only to the good. To get more people thinking in a bit more sort of, customer or user focused way, is only, to the advantage. I've kind of used, sort of dropping product managers into sort of shadowing arrangements sometimes to build up better relationships with the different departments, say, whether it's finance or sales or whatever else. Because actually it's useful for the product person to gain empathy and understanding of the difficulties and challenges of that role, but also it rubs off a bit on the particular team they're working with as well. And that's only a good thing.
Just need a few more of those on the board.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Should we move on to the third topic? Let's look at then some things we can do to set up your team for success. Okay, so reminder why we're doing this. So poor management performance. So unfortunately, it's us that are the problem. It says 17% of product managers who left a job. And similarly, bad team culture said 15% of product managers who left their job. So what are they saying they want from us? Well, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. What they're actually saying is 20% said, don't micromanage us so much, give us more autonomy to take our own decisions. And this idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose comes from actually a variety of different sources, but I think one of the ones that most people know is Daniel Pink's book, Drive. And he says that the key to motivated, engaged people is to give them a working environment where they have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what this means is autonomy, being able to take their own decisions, not being kind of forced to push everything up through tiers of hierarchy. Mastery is where they feel that they have the ability to get better and master their own particular discipline, be it product management or anything else. And purpose is kind of almost the trickiest one, because it's instilling in people the thing that's going to motivate them to get out of bed, the purpose for what they're actually doing and why it matters. And when we think about thinking about the very beginning where we talked about human outcomes over outputs, the trick to instilling purpose in a team is to make sure they're focused on those human outcomes, the things that matter to people, rather than the outputs, the things, the widgets, the features, the lines of code that they're churning out. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose are the foundations for a strong, high-performing team. But fundamentally, it's all about trust. Organizations almost fear, in many of the ones I've worked with at least anyway, fear giving teams control over their own destiny. They don't trust them enough to take their own decisions without supervision. Saying you trust your product teams and showing that your organization trusts them are different things. So where you have, a process that requires constant status reporting up the chain, has a requirement to escalate decision-making beyond certain limits, or where metrics are put upon the team without them having any input into them, these, or indeed metrics that are kind of focused on outputs, again, or vanity metrics rather than human outcomes that are directly related to what the product's trying to achieve. All of these things undermine that sense of trust that you're trying to establish within your teams. And it's so easy to fall into this trap. Traditional project management metrics like being on time, on budget, on scope are all measures of output. There's no human factor in any of those things. What really matters is whether the product solves the problem effectively for the people it's intended for. So through the team's understanding of user needs and hopefully their autonomy, they'll be able to set their own sensible measures of success, what good looks like for their particular product. 20% of product managers also want their leaders to ensure that every team member feels safe and respected at work. And this is also known as psychological safety. Now, I totally get that culture is not something you can flick change with the flick of a switch. It's something that often I'm brought in to try and help with, but it's something that literally takes years to actually make stick, and relies on top to bottom agreement that this is actually the direction the organization needs to go. But as leaders, we have a disproportionate effect on the behavior of our teams. So we have to set the example, and that means everyone, the CEO, the MD, whoever, downwards. We have to set a good example, and ideally a good one. And it should also be a level playing field. What rules for psychological safety, which we'll talk about in a second, what rules we have should be the same for everyone. It shouldn't be, one set of behaviors for leadership and one set of behaviors for everyone else. So psychological safety, just in case we're not familiar with this, this is where we are talking about a culture of openness and mutual respect in an organization. And this is where everyone in the team feels safe in front of their peers to make mistakes without recrimination, take risks, be vulnerable, not know all the answers, speak their mind openly, and be themselves, bring their whole selves to the organization rather than wearing this kind of mask of their business persona. And it's really important because this all came from a study where we had situations where there was a junior nurse failing to query a surgeon's mistake because she was afraid of doing so. And as a result, the surgeon's mistake led to the death of patients. So this kind of fear of piping up and being able to speak their own mind openly is something that is really challenging when we're trying to empower our teams and make them really, really high performance. And it all comes from the work that Amy Edmondson did, who first coined the term psychological safety. So most organizations think the way to get people to do things and encourage them to do so is around this scale of motivation and accountability. So another like carrot and stick, rewarding success and not rewarding or punishing failure. And when you've got organizations that don't really bother kind of enforcing any reward or otherwise for the things they do, you get this kind of apathy because it doesn't really matter what you do and people don't really kind of want to do anything. But when you go too far the other direction and everything is all about hitting targets and your performance related bonuses is the be all and end all and all that kind of thing, you actually drive people into this kind of anxiety zone. Now, there is another way of looking at this. When we start to introduce psychological safety as a different dimension to our organization, so the level of openness we have in our organizations, then we get two things happening. We clearly want to be in the top right, in the learning zone, where we have high motivation and accountability and high levels of psychological safety. Because if we don't have the motivation and accountability, even with psychological safety, it's lovely for people to work in that environment, but there's no real motivation for them to really kind of push on to the next level. So what we want is a combination of high psychological safety and high motivation and accountability. And so the way that Amy Edmondson described these two things is the motivation and accountability is like the gas pedal for accelerating an organization. And psychological safety is like taking your foot off the brake to allow the organization to move more freely. Another thing that was quite useful from a community point of view was the team's social charter. This was an example from GDS, Government Digital Service, and they put this up because they wanted to show new starters all of the unwritten rules or the unwritten social rules that the team had. And this actually kind of went viral when they shared it. It's one of the things that the team writes for themselves, but it's interesting because the exercise of doing this can bring up some interesting things. If as leaders, we're kind of reacting with horror to the kind of things the team has said should be okay, we should be asking ourselves, well, why do we have a problem with this? Why are we so horrified at this? Why don't we want this thing to be okay? So we should really think about this as a way to really understand how our teams want to work and how our teams want to behave. Do be careful. One caveat I would say is be careful when there's like a big elephant in the room type problem in your organization. Maybe everyone is grumpy about kind of feeling overworked and underpaid. I don't know, whatever it could be. If you've got that kind of elephant in the room, don't go and create a chirpy list of it's okay to do this and do that, because that'll just annoy people. Instead, go and deal with the elephant in the room first, and then when that's resolved, kind of think about doing this as well. And here's another example, actually from one of the NHS trusts back in April, right in the middle of the beginning of the outbreak. This is a different kind of thing, but again, it's letting the team basically express what is acceptable behavior for them within the organization and kind of being given permission from leadership, either tacitly or explicitly, to behave in these ways. You've probably seen in the news, SpaceX has done another kind of relatively successful test, except they didn't quite stick the landing on the Starship iteration recently. But jumping back to October, they had to scrub 2 separate rocket launches just 36 hours apart. So you can actually see both of the rockets, one in the distance and one in the foreground. And in response to this, Elon Musk jumps on a plane from Texas and goes across to the teams here. In some organizations, that would be, oh God, we're all going to get fired, because the boss, the chief executive coming out to see what the hell's going on is usually a bad sign. But in this case, Elon Musk is also the chief engineer at SpaceX. So what he was actually doing was coming along to Florida to, yes, motivate his team, but also to support his team, to lend his technical expertise to help them solve the challenges of launching rockets on time, because it's not easy. But I like this as an example of someone coming along, not to go and shout at their team and put the fear of God into them, but instead to say, look, this is really important. You're having problems. How can I help? And that style of leadership is, I think, very much the kind of example that we should be setting to our teams. So very quickly, we'll do our last little round table. What can we do to set up our teams for success? Does anyone want to jump in on that?
I think you've highlighted a number of the things, right? You've got to ensure that the team is equipped and understands how to effectively execute on their job, right? Making sure that they have the air coverage from you as the manager and their leader to be able to execute and not be hounded with some of the politics that could be creeping around from other areas of the business. I think that's paramount.
Does anyone have any particular examples of how they've been able to help establish psychological safety in their organizations?
Yeah, so I have actually had a scenario where there was a lot of difficulty of the relationship between R&D and product. Because product management was a new function at the company. It was engineering driven before, and there was a whole new initiative. And what I found is encouraging the teams to start having a regular group session, right? Not where they're so much worried about, how do we execute on something, but more of how do we become more personable with one another and trust one another to be, to work together. And that allowed the engineering team to become much more comfortable with the product management function because they were more connected on a personal level with the product managers.
Perfect. I'm conscious of time. So what I'll do is I'll just finish off the presentation, and then if anyone wants to stick around and ask further questions, feel free to do so. But I just want to make sure that the people who do have a time constraint can jump off. We talked about understanding product managers better, to understand how we can support them better. And that's really to make sure we've got empathy with what they're trying to achieve and what motivates them. We talked about being clear on how product managers can progress, if not necessarily in more senior roles, then in greater challenge, perhaps, in what they're doing. And we as leaders, as managers, should be supporting them to do so. And the third thing is it's absolutely important to have a high-performing team to make sure they've got a sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And within that is this idea of psychological safety, making sure there's a culture of openness, not just within that team, but ideally across your whole organization. Thank you very much for listening. I greatly appreciate all of the fantastic comments and questions you've given. If there's anything else you'd like to ask, now would be a great time. I don't know, Mary, if there's anything you or James want to round off with at the end?
No, just if there's any questions for you, really, and then we can wrap up. But no, thank you. That was really great.
Oh, thank you very much. If anyone does want to get in touch with me, the easiest way is to just drop me an email. You can see the web address up on there, or alternatively, if you search for Jock Busuttil on LinkedIn, there's not that many of us, so you should be able to find me pretty easily.
So, Jock, I do have a couple of things.
Yeah, sure.
Autonomy. Every product person I brought into the organization has this pie in the sky idea that they're going to be able to just make decisions. I think that's great, except the more complex and regulated the environment is, the less autonomy there is. So where is this where is this originating? I mean, I understand. I've led product resources for a decade, but in my organization, resources discovered very quickly that they weren't going to be able to operate in a fully autonomous environment and make decisions and push product forward. And then over time said, yeah, it was kind of ludicrous for me to come in thinking that. So I mean, we all come from different environments and we've all worked in different industries. Is what I'm saying completely ludicrous, or does it resonate?
Well, in my experience, I mean, there's a common fear that, when somebody new is coming into an organization, they're relatively junior, because product managers aren't necessarily particularly senior roles with an organization, at least to begin with. There's often a fear that entrusting them to make good decisions, particularly in highly regulated areas, is potentially opening up the organization to risk. I guess the answer to that is, in the situations where that hasn't gone wrong, where that hasn't gone so well, what were the reasons for that? Was it a lack of experience? Was it a lack of support? Was it a lack of understanding of the regulatory constraints? And in those situations, I would be looking to say, well, okay, what support can we give those individuals to help them avoid making the same kind of mistakes again in the future? Or indeed better, what can we do to prevent them making them in the first place by ensuring they have the right knowledge and experience at their fingertips, if not themselves up to speed with it yet? But I think that where there's that tendency of saying, well, we can't possibly let the team take the right decisions because we can't trust them to, I think really then at that point you're just saying, well, we are going to take decisions on behalf of the team. And so there's really no role anymore for the product manager because they don't have any control over their own destiny. I would say that even in highly regulated areas, whether it's healthcare or whether it's legal governmental stuff or whatever else, there's always scope for the team to learn and become the experts in that domain area, and actually to become more expert in that part of regulation than maybe anyone else in the organization. But we have to give them the opportunity to do so. And if we are worried of them making mistakes, then we need to figure out a way to allow them to make less risky mistakes, and to provide a safety net for them to allow them to learn without fear of, either having all of their decision-making ability taken away from them, or without actually making a mistake that's quite impactful and problematic for the organization. But I think without that autonomy, without that empowerment, there is no role for a product manager, because their role is dependent on being able to make decisions on the destiny and the direction of their product, and how indeed their team works together to do that. It's very difficult to motivate a team that's in a position where they don't have autonomy. And so I would say that if you're struggling to find that, maybe the question to be thinking about is, how can you better support them to avoid the concerns that the organization has, while still giving the team the ability to function as a product team?
Yeah, I guess there's just a difference in the line of determining where product responsibilities begin and end. Because in a financial services environment, there's continually changing regulations. There's an entire compliance team. There's significant review processes of everything that's getting ready to be published. So, choosing font, choosing placement, choosing paths, journeys, that stuff's all really taken out of the hands of a traditional quote unquote product resource. So, looking at funnels, looking at dropouts, making recommendations for changes, absolutely, but the final decisions aren't always in the hands of the product resource. So what I've always done is just allowed the decisions to be made by the product team, and then go through a process of reviewing those and making recommendations for changes, so they feel like they're driving, and then you're explaining the reason why the things aren't necessarily happening the way they were designed.
So maybe to give an example, so in one of the jobs I was in before I started up my own company, I was working at Experian, and I was working at a bit of Experian that had responsibility for maybe 50 or 60 different sets of data, some of which were very highly sensitive government data sets and that kind of thing. And the person that was responsible for the overall direction and strategy, and basically being the expert on the changing regulatory environment for those data sets, was one of the more junior people on my team. And the reason for that was because he had the aptitude, the ability, and the interest to manage those data sets better than anyone else in the organization. That person has now become the head of data. He actually came back to Experian after leaving in a much more senior role for data strategy. But without that experience, without that trust in him in the first situation, he would have never had the opportunity to grow and develop, and indeed to be able to contribute to Experian in the way he did. So I would say that if you're not giving your product managers and your product teams the opportunity to become the experts in those continually changing regulatory environments, because, one of the things that product teams are good with is dealing with uncertainty and change. The technical standards they're dealing with are continually changing. The user needs are continually evolving and changing. The market competition is continually changing and evolving. And the regulatory environment is continually evolving and changing. If you give them the opportunity to be responsible for keeping on top of that, you might be surprised with the results you get, providing, you give them, as I say, that support and reassurance and trust that they are able to take decisions, and you can help them steer away from potential decisions that might be problematic. But ultimately, the things that they are doing is, driving their own decisions and making their own path forward.
Yeah, in an organization like Experian, you're going to have a lot more resources than
not necessarily. Not necessarily. My team was 4 people.
Okay. Well, we should continue the conversation, because
there's different approaches for sure.
There definitely are. And when you have very tight timelines to deliver, it's difficult to bring someone into the organization if they are not from the industry, and give them an opportunity to get up to speed on all the regulatory constraints.
It takes
time.
time.
Again, it comes down to where you're drawing the line of what's considered product's responsibility, because in some organizations, it might be, a very, very small area is what falls under product, and it's really more around design, develop, delivery, where in other organizations it involves research, analysis. So,
as I said, it depends it varies from organization to organization. My approach is to make sure that teams are in charge of their own destiny, and that's really full responsibility from top to bottom for the product and the way it gets out to market. So that's everything from financial responsibility to making sure the regulatory stuff is right. But it's only through trusting and empowering people that we actually get good performance from the teams I've worked with. Perfect. Any other questions before we finish? No? Well then, thanks very much again for all your questions and all your comments. If you want to get in touch, please do. More than happy to discuss, help out in a professional capacity or otherwise. So hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jock.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.